All right, welcome in. This is the Individual Skills Hockey Podcast, a podcast that aims to bring quality education to youth hockey coaches, parents, and players with the mission of having a positive impact on the crazy youth hockey world. Today, we have a great episode for you. We have founder of Individual Skills Clinics, Rick Beckfeld, in. Thank you for being here, Rick, and how you doing today?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, a question I always ask all the guests is a little bit of background on how you got started with the game, kind of where you grew up, and then mainly the kind of the meat. What I wanted to get into is the history of individual skills. But maybe you can just start.
Sure.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New Hope, Minnesota. I played in the New Hope youth programs, the hockey programs. Played from back in that time. You started in Pee Wees. That was really the first year you had it.
Oh, really?
And organized. You did a lot of rink ratting, a lot of playing on outdoor rinks, but organized not till Pee Wees. So I played my youth hockey there. Went to Cooper High School, and then went on and played some junior hockey, and ultimately played 4 years at the University of Wisconsin Stout. And then I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to play professionally in Europe after college. And from that point, that was pretty much the end of my playing career.
All right. And when did you get into training hockey, coaching hockey, or how did individual skills start, I guess?
Well, it pretty much started with my son, who at the time I kind of got the idea that this might be something needed. He was going into his first year of squirts, and a gentleman that was coaching the Pee Wee A team at Armstrong at the time, Steve Bernhardt, and I talked about it, and he thought we should do something with individual skill development during the summer months, because there really wasn't any of that going on at the time. And so that's pretty much how it got started, and that was in 1995. So that was the first year, and that was an Armstrong individual skills clinics. It was just basically the Armstrong kids, and we had Bantams, squirts, Pee-wees, all skating at the same time, just working on skill development stuff.
Yeah, which is obviously completely different than today's world of 75 different options for these kids. But it sounds like if you were a Pee-wee in Armstrong in the summer, did you have any other options to skate at all?
Not really. There was no summer leagues like there are now. There wasn't the rinks that there are now. We did our first 2 years of Armstrong individual skills out of Braemar, because that was the only place we could get ice. This wasn't here. Plymouth wasn't here at the time. There was one rink at New Hope at the time, and there just wasn't the availability of ice, so we ended up getting it at Braemar, and we did it once a week on Sunday evenings.
And then I think we were talking before this, high school coaches would run their own hockey skills back then, correct?
Yes. They would do it basically on their own. They would be involved in different hockey schools. There was no kind of organized summer training program like there are now. It started out, it was called a satellite training program, and the high school coaches would get involved, and they were able to skate their players during a certain amount of time, their high school returning players as well as youth players, and that became some of the STP stuff that you see today.
Right, and I think you mentioned that the State High School League kind of, during the 90s, kind of loosened up when coaches could actually contact their players, and created that kind of summer waiver program, or period it's called now.
Correct. There used to be, where in the high school league, they would allow you to be on the ice with your players simply from the time the season started until the season ended. And at that point, you weren't allowed to be on the ice with your players whatsoever to work with them. Right,
that's crazy. How did ice skills kind of grow into what it became in the early 2000s or mid 2000s of touching different players in different areas and kind of focusing on the high school age, correct?
Correct. When we initially started, it was an Armstrong only program, and we did that for 2 or 3 years. And a gentleman, Duke Johnson, who I played college hockey with. He was a lineman of mine in college. His son went to Cooper High School, and he basically mimicked our idea of individual skills for the Cooper kids. Did that for a couple of years, and then ultimately we merged, and we had one program that would basically catered not only to Cooper and Armstrong, but we opened it up at that point in time. And that's when it started to take off and grow. Then at that point, we were working with squirts, peewees, bantams, high school. We were working with different levels. And ultimately, where that took us was to focusing on the older levels, being bantams moving into high school, and then beyond. Junior players, college players, and some pro players that we've had over the years.
Right, and as this growth occurred, I think what's unique about, from my perspective on the kind of the story of individual skills, was it never got huge in the sense that you never had hundreds and hundreds of players you were touching every summer. It kind of stayed, or I guess maybe you can talk about kind of your feeling on how the growth occurred and not letting it get too big to where the instruction was watered down.
Sure. That was something that a lot of the programs at the time wanted to grow. They wanted to be bigger. We felt, Duke and I, and then ultimately bringing Pat in to the program and Blake Sloan, is that we had to be on the ice with the players to make it successful. And the programs that grew extensively would hire outside high school kids, college kids, to do the instruction. They would plan out the program, but they would not be on the ice. And I found early on that you can't do the job without being on the ice. A good friend of mine, Scott Bugstead, him and I have chatted about this, and the fact that he's had a very successful program, but he's never grown it to the point where he can't be on the ice with them at the same time. And because you lose the quality. And for us, quality was the most important part. Far bigger than the monetary piece, the being able to develop, more kids. It was, let's just do the ones we can do in a limited number and do them really good.
Right, that's awesome. I wanted to ask about kind of the flavor or kind of core beliefs that individual skilled had as you were getting going on how you approached this individual skills training.
Sure.
What are some of the most important things that you guys felt hockey players needed to get better at, and how did you go about helping kids?
We early on made a determination that for players to get better, they have to work on the things they're not very good at. Youth coaches, especially at the time, were concerned with winning hockey games, and they would never ask their players to do something in a game that they weren't good at. So we worked on things like outside edge control for younger players and being very competent on the outside edge, which is very difficult for younger players. Players during that time period could go straight ahead. I mean, they could fly straight ahead on their inside edges, but when you had to turn, when you had to use agility, when you had to transition, they struggled. So we spent a great deal of time working on those types of things, as well as playing the puck on the backhand. That's another thing that, a lot of youth coaches don't even allow it because it turns over pucks. But you can't get better at things you don't work on. So we thought that the things we're going to work on in our summer stuff is going to be the things that kids aren't very good at, doing things that are uncomfortable. A lot of edge work, uncomfortable edge work, a lot of transitions, uncomfortable transitions, things that are outside edge stops on younger kids. Instead of just doing a snowplow stop or an inside-outside stop, just stop on an outside edge, just getting comfortable with it. We started doing, almost originally, we started doing what's called a moving warm-up. And then every week we would add to that moving warm-up where the players would skate around the rink, and we would ask them to do different things, very awkward things while they're skating around the rink. You can utilize ice time pretty well that way because you've got the whole ice sheet and everybody's moving at the same time. And so we started throwing into different things that were very uncomfortable for players to do during the moving warm-up. And that became a very, very important part of what we did. We do that for 15 minutes in the beginning of every session. And we really thought that it had a benefit.
Yeah, I love it. And I think it's important to understand the doing working on your weaknesses in the off season? Because from my perspective, when I have a defenseman sitting in my office in the coach's room and they're wondering how they can be more effective and earn playing time, a lot of times I'll tell them, focus on what you do well, because like this is not the time to try to not be yourself. But like you said, the off season, you need to focus on what you don't do well. And even, I mean, when you think about youth hockey, coaches should be focusing on that too, because it's not about winning games at Squirts and Peewees. It is about that development. So I think that's really interesting.
No, I agree with you. I agree that is something, and I've told players that I've trained, individual players I've trained, when they're going into a tryout, is do what you do and do it better than you've ever done it. Don't try to play out at somebody else's game. Don't try to do things that are uncomfortable. That's not the time. That's not where you work on your weak stuff. This is where you showcase your strong points. So in agreement with what you're telling your players, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the time to work on a backhand pass coming out of your own zone. Not good.
But I think you see some summer training programs not really hit on the weaknesses, and kids just get really good at one area. I mean, you see it all the time. Really good puck handlers you enjoy practicing what you're good at. Mm-hmm. So really good puck handlers just love going through obstacle courses and cones. Really good skaters love doing the edge work because they can be in perfect posture and glide around and be really good at it, and that's fun. But
absolutely,
you're not going to get any better at the other areas of the game.
No, you're certainly not. And I've seen it countless times with younger players that are successful as younger players, but they're successful for many different reasons. Sometimes they're bigger, they're stronger. Sometimes they just have great hands, but they can't skate. So they always focus on what they do well. And I've seen many of these players go into obscurity before they even hit high school because they've never worked on the things that they don't do well.
Yeah, and they think that what got them to this point is going to continue to get them to where they want to end up being.
Absolutely, no question. They think that if they're a little bit ahead of everybody else, they're just going to continue to go that way and stay a little bit ahead of them without doing any more work. They fail to take into consideration that these players that they're ahead of as a 10-year-old is going to work their butt off, and they're going to be ahead of them by the time they're 14 or 15. And that's the thing that happens a lot of time. I've often said, and this is maybe a little off topic, that the curse of a younger player is to be really, really good, really young, because it comes easy. And you lose a little bit of the incentive to really, really work. But the other kids, they want to get better, and they're not that good. And they're going to outwork you, and they're going to end up taking your job away.
Yeah, for sure. All right, kind of the next section I wanted to touch on is the scouting process. So maybe we can start off with you telling us how you got into scouting and when that occurred and how that went for you. Why were you interested in it, and how'd that go?
Well, it's really interesting how I did get into scouting. When my son Brett was going basically between sophomore and junior year, he wanted to go to a junior tryout camp, and he basically got invited by Cedar Rapids to their junior camp, and it wasn't like a generic letter that went out. It was a phone call from the head coach who had been there and watched the game and wanted him to come out. And my first thought was, this kid is not ready to play junior hockey. There's no way he's ready to play junior hockey. He's not going to.
You said between his sophomore and junior year?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. And so I said, if he wants to do the tryout, we'll do the tryout. So he went down to Cedar Rapids and did the tryout. And I wasn't even there until the last day. I drove down because he was in the All-Star game, and he said he was playing really well, and I started to get a little concerned. So I went down, and he did. He played really well, and they wanted to keep him and put him on the roster. And I said, absolutely no way. Ultimately, they worked out something where he could do a before and after his junior year. And so he billeted down there and lived down there until the high school season started, and then came back up and played high school. Now, the way I got into it is I got to know the coaching staff, which was Mark Carlson and a gentleman, the assistant coach by the name of A.J. Taves, who's now a scout with the Washington Capitals. And I got to know them fairly well, and it was the next year that he went down there and played full-time. And then I was basically asked if I would be interested in being their regional scout for the Midwest. Basically, at that time, you were talking about basically Minnesota and Wisconsin. There was really nothing in the Dakotas or South Dakota or Iowa.
Yeah.
It was all pretty much that area. And I said, yeah, I'd love to. So we worked out an agreement and started doing that. And then from that point, I did it with them for 10 more years. But that's how I kind of got into it, by happenstance. And it, I guess people talk about players getting on teams because of their parents. This was the dad getting a job because of his kid. And then backwards.
That's funny. And then you moved on to help Arizona out a little bit?
I moved from there to Des Moines, the Buccaneers,
okay,
where I took a job as the director of player personnel. So I was like the head scout there, and I got to do the draft, and I basically got to monitor the whole player aspect of it, which I enjoyed. I did that for 4 years, and then was given an opportunity by the Arizona Coyotes, which I did for 3 years with them.
And how do you look back at those jobs? Do you look back at it with like positivity or
for the most part,
okay,
yes. I think in any situation, a lot depends upon the organization you work for and the people you work with. And I've worked with some really, really good people, and I've worked with some not so good people. But overall, the experience and what I learned from that was priceless. Just the working with players, especially in Des Moines, where I was on the ice with players quite a bit, working with players at that level. And it's not a whole lot different than high school. Some players get there because they're just talented.
Yeah.
And other players get there because they worked harder than everybody else. So you see the same kind of thing. It's just at a little different level. But all in all, it was a great learning experience. I met some great people, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat.
Nice. So what's the biggest thing you would tell parents about the scouting process that most people don't understand?
Biggest thing is be patient
Okay.
with the process. Don't be in a hurry. In today's world, there isn't any secrets. There's no diamonds in the rough. Everybody knows everybody. And because of all the opportunities players have for these different events they partake in, you've got the high school elite league now, you've got so many different tournaments that take place that nothing really falls through the cracks anymore. So I get asked by parents of high school kids, do we need to send out letters? Do we need to contact coaches? Do we need to? And I said, I'll be honest with you. When I was the guy getting these emails, when I was with Des Moines, most of them would end up emails. I'd maybe read a little bit of one of them, and it would just be delete. If we didn't know about them, I wasn't interested in what, I didn't have time. And the good players are found. And instead of wasting time trying to communicate with these different teams, spend the time having fun with your kids. That's what I would really say. It's more valuable.
Yeah. I think that's a huge misconception on people get stressed out that they're not being noticed. And so they end up signing up for a lot of different camps that are in town here, trying to get seen. But it sounds like, just take the Elite League, for example. Like if you're in the Elite League, you're on the radar, correct? Mm-hmm. There's no way you'd slip through the cracks in that situation.
From every level, NHL, junior, college, they all know.
Yeah. So another misconception I think people have is that it's a longer process than people think. So I'm thinking of if you know somebody's watching you for a particular game, there's a lot of nervousness, which is fine, but it's all or nothing on that one game. Like a scout is going to say yes or no based on one game.
No, and that's not going to happen. That's never going to happen.
So how many times would you, let's say you're scouting someone for Des Moines, how many times would you see them play before you recommended to the GM?
Oh, before we would consider drafting him, I would probably see him play, or at least one of our scouts, we would probably see him play 5 or 6 times, minimum. We would probably at some point do an interview with him, and just to get a feel for his character. In the NHL, it's a little different because there's a lot more money involved, and you can do a lot more. But in junior, and theoretically, where high school kids are, every high school kid who wants to continue on playing hockey wants to play in the USHL. It's a given because that's the best junior level.
Yep.
And so as a scout in juniors, we're not doing recruiting. We know the player wants to come to our league, and because in the USHL you have a draft system, the players don't have a choice, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And so consequently, players get a little unnerved, especially when they're in their senior year, and they haven't heard from a team in the USHL. Well, the reason for that is probably because nobody wants to expose themselves. So whenever I would call a player, first thing I'd ask them, how many other teams have you spoke to in our league? So we always want to know what the interest is with the other team. So if I was to talk to a player first and Green Bay calls them, they're going to say the same thing. Oh, I talked to Cedar Rapids. Well, now they know we're interested in them. You don't want to give away your cards. So be patient with the process. You may not hear from teams until you get right around draft time or when the letters go out for tryout camps.
Yeah, and especially if you're not, I'm thinking like if you're not a phase 1 pick, some people could say that you are a little bit more of a diamond in the rough. So just to your point, like nobody wants to spill the beans on some kid that they found that's playing.
Correct. Correct.
Or late bloomer.
Right.
That their senior year, they're really, really good, and that's why they're not maybe reaching out yet.
No, you're absolutely correct. And, you talk about the phase 1 with the affiliate draft. That's an underage draft where teams are able to hold players for up to 3 years before they have to actually come in and play. But that number of that birth year goes down every year. So you either have to bring players in or you drop them off the list. But the biggest draft is the entry draft, the phase 2 draft, because that's when you're bringing players in to look at that you want to draft, that you think can play for you, that are at that maturity level where they can step in and play right away. And so that's the biggest draft, biggest part of the draft by far is the phase 2.
I'd like to ask you about how high school coaches fit into this process. I think there's a lot of people out there that look at a high school coach and think because of something a coach is doing, you're screwing over my kid. He's not going to get noticed. He's not getting the proper amount of ice time. He's not getting the proper amount of power play time. What effect does a high school coach actually have on your opinion of a player?
Well, first of all, I've known a lot of coaches at different levels, but I don't know of one coach who hasn't wanted to win games at all costs. They want to win. That's what they do. So are they going to not play the player that could probably help them win the game? It's never going to happen. So as far as that piece goes, if you have a child and you don't think they're getting enough playing time, or that they should be doing more, or the coach should be doing more for them, player needs to go talk to the coach. That's the number one thing. Not the parent, the player needs to go talk to the coach and find out why. Now, it may be a satisfactory answer, may not be, but most times it's a matter where the player needs to look in the mirror, because generally it's reflected back on something you're doing. And if the coach is honest with them and tells them that, then it's the player's job to work hard at that, to get better at that. But coaches, and I see it more and more at the high school level, when you're in youth hockey, players are usually pretty good. You don't have to deal with them. You have to deal with parents more.
Yeah.
When you get into anything after high school, it's not parents anymore, it's all players.
Yeah.
But when you're in high school, you have both players and parents. That's not easy.
Yeah. Talk about what, if you were scouting a player, what types of questions would you ask their coach? What would you ask a coach about a player that you might be interested in?
Well, number one thing is his character. Is he a leader? Is he a follower? Is he high maintenance? What's his work ethic? And they'll give you a history on the player, and a lot of times they've had him for 3 years, and they know these kids pretty well inside and out.
Yeah.
And most coaches will be very honest with you because it's kind of like a code of conduct that's spoken, on a not for public viewing. So they don't want to give a scout bad information because they have a reputation. And they don't, in this business, this hockey business, reputation is everything. And so you're honest with you have to be honest with them. But that's the main thing, because we can see what they do on the ice. We can do heights and weights, and we can look at genetic history, what's your dad like, what's your mom like, how tall, we can do all that stuff.
Yeah.
But we can't get into their heads. And that's the biggest thing we talk to coaches about.
Right. Last question on the scouting process. I think there's players out there sometimes that have a hard time buying into what the team is trying to actually accomplish because they're concerned about their future. So what would be some advice to those players struggling with, the obvious example is a defenseman that wants to score a lot of points and get up in the ice. Get up in the ice and not be so concerned about the defensive side of the puck. So what's your advice for players that are trying to, because let's be honest, getting points is important in order to, move on. So what's your advice to those types of players?
Well, it kind of comes back to when you get to the level that we're talking about, like seniors in high school and that level, do what you do and do it really well. And as a scout, when you look at a player, we'll just talk about defensemen for a minute. It takes all kinds of players and all kinds of defensemen to make a hockey team. You can't have 7 rushing defensemen on a hockey team. And at the same token, you can't have 7 stay-at-home, bump pucks up the ice defensemen either. It takes a balance of them. So we would look for all types. We would look for the defenseman that can make that easy first pass. Most important pass of the game is the first pass out of the zone. Who can make that better? Who can do that with proficiency and with some calmness? The easy thing to see is a player that's got tremendous offense. He's a wild player. But those kind of players, sometimes they can't defend in their own end. And you have to look at all aspects of it. So from a defensive standpoint, the hardest guy to find is not that offensive defenseman. It's that stay-at-home, do your job, first pass defenseman. That's the hardest guy to find. Offensively, for the forwards, you need guys that hunt pucks, that win pucks, that battle for pucks. They're more important than having everybody that can score goals, because, as I've said many times to other people, you can't have a team of first-line centers. You just can't.
Yeah.
They're not a good hockey team. And there's been a number of colleges that have gone down that road that haven't had success because of that fact. They haven't gotten the entirety of a hockey team. Gotten really good players, but not the makeup of a hockey team. So I guess in answer to your question, every type of a player has value. It isn't just the goal scorers.
And you never know what a scout is looking for their team, for their needs for that next year.
Absolutely not.
And because of the way that USHL draft system is set up, you could pretty much assume that you're going to have a goal scorer on your top line. That is kind of taken care of. So there's a bunch more roles that need to be filled, and maybe they need a right shot defenseman that can play 13 minutes and do it really, really well. So
and can kill penalties.
Yeah.
And do the things that don't show up in box scores.
Right.
And that's where you have to have a little bit of experience and a little bit of an eye for that kind of stuff in a player. And that's, but that's highly important in in building a hockey club.
Right. All right, awesome. We can move on. In our last section here, I'd like to ask you about being a parent of two
Skaters?
skaters, pretty
Yeah.
good skaters.
Yeah.
So just talk about how that experience was and for your daughter and your son.
Sure. Well, my daughter was a figure skater, basically 2 years older than my son. And she did skating lessons to start with. But she took a liking to it, and over a number of years, she wanted to do individual figure skating lessons. And the only time they were offered in the program she was in was at 6 o'clock in the morning. But she wanted to do it. So the deal I made with her was that I'm never going to wake you up for it. You have to wake yourself up. And this was when she was probably 10 years old.
Okay.
And to be honest with you, in doing that with her for probably 6 years before she was able to drive herself, I never once had to wake her up, and she never once missed a session. And because she took ownership in it. Brett, my son, was not my daughter. He just loved to play. He just loved to play the game. And he would play it anywhere, anytime. But he wasn't as into, he just wanted to play it. He didn't want to get better at it. He just wanted to play it.
Yeah.
Well, there's value in that too.
Oh, yeah.
Just being on the ice.
Just the pond hockey.
It's amazing what you can develop by just being on the ice. And I would take them, both of them, to open skating. And this, I think, is why they both became in their own rights very, very good skaters, because we spent a ton of time at open skating sessions. We would go on a Sunday. We would go maybe do an hour at New Hope and then get something to eat. And then there'd be an hour at Minnetonka. We'd go there. And maybe we'd end up going to Parade for an hour on a Sunday.
It's awesome.
And they'd skate. And to me, that's the part that's kind of missing. Young people, their kids are mites and their kids are squirts. And hey, how do I get him to stop? How do I get him to get on an outside edge? How do you take them to the pond? Take them to open skating. They'll eventually figure that stuff out. Then you work on getting better at it. But I mean, the more they're on the ice, the better skaters are going to be in general.
Yeah, and I'm curious on how what would your advice be to parents on how to identify when their player is ready for 6 a.m. skates, for example, or more dedicated training on trying to get better? How do you recognize that your kid actually wants to do it?
That's kind of a difficult question because most parents will tell you, my kid wants to do this. He's ready for it. This is all his idea. But in many cases, that's not the truth. It's the parents that may want it more than the kid does, and good for them. I give them all the credit. They were giving the kid the opportunity. Yeah. But it isn't those types of skates are not for everybody. I've had players that I've worked with at 6 a.m. skates that come in and you swear to God they've been up for the last 3 hours because they're just excited to be there and revved up. And then you get kids that kind of fall asleep getting dressed in the dressing room. And it's kind of it's a difficult question. For a parent because we all want our parent. I mean, us parents want our kids to be dedicated, devoted, willing to do more, willing to work hard. But maybe they will work hard, but maybe that isn't their thing. And so you try it. But if you got, I mentioned that with my daughter. She had to take ownership in it, or I wasn't going to do it because it cost a lot of money, and I wasn't going to pry her out of bed to get her there. And she took ownership and she gained from it. That's a big thing, and I tell parents that today. I said, and I told a girl that I skated not very long ago that we talked about training her, and I said, the thing is, you will get yourself out of bed. Nobody's going to wake you, and that was great, and she did, and she was great to work with. She was happy to be there, and she had a great time, and learned. So they have to take ownership in it. And if your child is not willing to take complete ownership in it, like it's his deal, then it's probably a bad investment.
I love that idea of waking up by yourself. I think everyone should do that tomorrow on if you are signed up in a not even, it doesn't have to be in the morning, right? Like
Right.
You need to remind your parent to, this is when we're leaving for our skate, for whatever the case may be.
You know, one other thing just on that topic, I've encouraged parents with younger players that make your kids pack their own bags, and if they forget a piece of equipment, they don't skate.
They don't get to play, yeah.
They'll learn very quickly to make sure that they pack all their equipment.
There's a funny story. I was coaching a Pee Wee team, and one of our players forgot his gloves. And one of our assistant coaches goes and sprints into the parking lot. He's like, I got my gloves. He can use mine. I got small hands. And Mom came running in and said, no, you're not. My kid's not playing today. And I was like, yeah,
That's a great
awesome.
story.
So,
That's a great story.
yeah.
And once we can get kids to take ownership, that's not just a hockey skill, that's a life skill. You take ownership in it, and you live and die by your decisions, what you do, what you make of it. And kids will, it's amazing how they will, we never give kids enough credit because we don't allow them to do it. We're so afraid they're going to oversleep that we have to wake them up.
Yeah.
So sometimes we just got to let them fail so they can succeed.
Awesome. All right, last question, and then we can get you out of here. I don't want to keep you too long. So you never really became a coach of a team, like during the winter. You were always focused on the training aspect of it in the off season. Talk a little bit about. Did you ever try it, or just talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I did. I coached 2 years. I coached a team in the Minnesota High School Elite League, and I found out that it really wasn't my passion. In the Elite League, you're a coach of a team, is what you are. You're not a trainer of individual players. You're a coach of a team. You don't have the time. You're not on the ice with them enough to actually, or the time to spend working with this particular defenseman on his outside pivots. I mean, there isn't. So you're coaching a team. You're trying to make the team better. And I just didn't find that I really loved it that much. And then ultimately, I was working for Cedar Rapids at the time, and this was early on in the High School Elite League. And that's back when the Elite League was really focused on keeping kids in high school hockey, which they are today too, but not quite as much because of with the online learning and things, you can do a lot more there. But back then, they were really trying to keep kids in it. So I was basically told it was a conflict of interest working in the USHL and coaching a team in the Elite League, so I had to make a decision. And at that point, it was very easy for me to make. And that was the first and last time I really coached a team. I just enjoy so much more being able to see players develop, individually develop, and that to me is that's what I was put here to do. It just seems, I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, no, I bring it up just as an example of when you are coaching your teams out there or you are doing some on-ice training, just think about like what you actually enjoy about the job and maybe try to do it a little bit more so that the kids get more out of it. Don't try to coach this XYZ team because you think it's going to look good for your resume. And I'm speaking more to the full-time coaches right now, but don't do anything that you aren't either comfortable or don't enjoy. So
that's a good point. That's a very good point, and I would agree with you 100%.
All right. Anything else you wanted to touch on before I let you go?
I think we kind of beat it up pretty good.
Thanks again for doing this, and maybe we can do a part 2 and get a little round table with Pat and Pete and Blake Sloan and really dive deeper into this development stuff. So thanks again.
Look forward to it, and thanks for having me.
You bet.